Dozens of states are now threatening to sue the federal government to thwart health care legislation. What the states are trying to do is about 90% hot air on politics. The 10% where the states have a shot, in my view, will be any parts of the new federal law that orders state governments to spend state money or enact state laws or regulate state behavior against what these state legislatures want to do. The states can only sue Congress if Congress commandeers the states and attempts to tell them what to do in areas reserved by the Constitution for the states to decide. The states cannot sue the feds because persons in those states have been harmed by the feds. Only those persons actually harmed by this new law could actually sue. As a state law, the state purports to invalidate federal law. Regrettably, the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution mandates that in areas where the feds are authorized to legislate, federal law will supersede state law. Joining me now to talk about all this in the Constitution and in Basic Economics 101 of what the government is doing to us is Tom Woods, author of 9 books on the economy or the government or history, including my favorite, the New York Times bestseller, Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. Tom, it's a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, so what happened last night? What happened to Basic Economics 101? If an insurance carrier is forced to insure somebody it doesn't want to insure, and if the insurance carrier is told you can't charge premiums for the cost that the person will genuinely drain from you, isn't that carrier likely to go out of business if this happens over and over and over again?
Yeah, of course, they're trying to take a private industry, which, of course, is completely screwed up in our society, but nevertheless, in principle, a private industry, and turn it into a welfare agency. You can run a welfare agency with a government because the government can get the money to fund it by just taking it from people. Private insurer can't do that. So, of course, if you're in effect taking the concept of insurance and turning it into a complete farce. It's like asking for fire insurance to cover a burning building.
You and I talked about this many times, Tom. How did we get to the point where the debate became not whether the government should provide some sort of health care, but how the government should provide health care? How did health care go from being a good, like my necktie or a T-shirt or a book or even food, shelter, or clothing, to a right, like freedom of speech and freedom of thought and privacy and freedom of worship? And how did the debate get to that end of things?
Well, I don't know exactly the precise moment, but we've had an extremely loose language whereby anything desirable suddenly becomes a right that you can demand from people. It's philosophically incoherent, and of course it's economically ruinous, because if we all come to accept this idea that I'm entitled to the fruits of your labor, then more and more, as more and more benefits, so-called, from the government are extended to me, it becomes marginally more and more desirable for me to be in the position that entitles me to the benefit.
Right.
So you wind up getting more and more people entitled to it, fewer and fewer suckers actually working to keep the system alive, and the thing becomes a house of cards. And we're clearly headed down that road. And every time they talk about these European healthcare models that everybody loves, well, the fact is that their finance ministers behind closed doors will tell you that they're going to bankrupt those countries, too. So we're headed down a terrible path.
What do you think will happen from your study of American history and the Constitution with, for example, Virginia, which has enacted legislation that purports to nullify portions of the federal health care? Now, you and I are strong supporters of the right of states to nullify. It was obviously and clearly retained by them when they joined the Union, when they accepted the Constitution.
Yeah.
But we also know the way the Supreme Court has, over the generations and centuries, tortured the Constitution into causing the feds to trump the states at almost every turn. Right. Will not a federal judge in Arlington, Virginia, basically say to the Attorney General of Virginia, what are you, crazy? Of course the federal government is going to supersede you. Go back to Richmond, and here's my invalidation of that statute.
Well, this is why I think the avenue of suing in the courts is really just a non-starter. I mean, whose courts are you going to sue in? You're suing in the federal government's own courts. So the federal government is going to ask itself, Do we have the powers to do this? And it's going to give itself the answer, why, yes, we do. I mean, this is, no, I think there's no point in doing that. Instead, I think they should just go ahead and refuse to comply. Because at this point, given that, we've tried everything, we've tried electing people, we've tried sending in petitions, we've done everything that we could do, I think it's unreasonable to expect that a government this out of control can be stopped by anything short of a really dramatic showdown. And so what, to me, nullification today amounts to really a statement by the state government that we in this state are prepared to engage in civil disobedience. And so regardless of what a federal judge says, if the people are sufficiently angry and committed to following this through come what may, then what are they going to do, send in the tanks? So, I mean, at least it's worth, given that everything else has failed, this is worth trying.
All right, but for the most part, Tom, these are individual mandates, meaning the feds have basically said, or once the president signs this into law, the feds will basically be saying, you will buy health insurance, and if you don't buy it, we will add to your tax bill. And if you don't pay that tax bill, we'll indict you. Now, under those circumstances, that person, the indicted person, would be in a position to challenge this, but the challenge, again, would be in one of the federal government's own courts. How could people as individuals, with the support of their state, refuse to comply with this?
At the very least, the state would have to establish a fund for the legal expenses of these people, at the very least. But what I think is it could at least happen is that if this begins to occur, if there seems to be a resistance movement, if people found organizations in the states that are committed to the resistance of this, and it begins to happen in a whole lot of states, such that the resistance seems to be extremely widespread,
right.
Well, then you get down to a question of wills, and then it becomes a political football for the opposition party. Not that I hold much hope for the Republicans, but for heaven's sake, this is a ready-made issue for them. I mean, what are you, threatening to throw people in jail because they won't buy some crummy health care package? You've got to be kidding me.
There's 37 states that are prepared to challenge the federal government. That's almost enough to amend the Constitution, Tom.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. The states could, presumably the states could submit amendments to the Constitution. Yet, on the other hand, one wonders, why would the federal government listen to these amendments any more than they've listened to the rest of the Constitution? And if they didn't obey an amendment the states submitted, then what recourse would we ultimately have to fall back on again, if not basically nullification?
I don't believe in the two-party system any more than you do. I think we have one big government party. We have a Republican version that likes war and deficits. We have a Democratic version that likes taxes and transfer payments. But my heart was broken last night by Congressman Stupak and the so-called pro-life Democrats in the House who caved because they somehow were persuaded that an executive order of the president can trump legislation. I mean, if the executive order of the president could trump legislation, then the president is a king.
Yeah.
Then the president could write anything he wants to. Then the president doesn't even need the Congress to get his proposals through.
I think those people were just, they know better than that, Judge. I think they were using that as a fig leaf so they could get away with doing this, and then inevitably when there is no presidential order coming forth or when it is challenged, they can protest their innocence. Oh, but I was assured that this wouldn't happen. Yeah, right.
Right. Tom Woods, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.